Our guest today is Graham Dempsey, a writer, poet, farmer, and the director of Sky Meadow Institute, an organization dedicated to promoting systems thinking about things that matter most. All of Brendan's work focuses on the meaning crisis and the reconstruction of spirituality in metamodernity. The focus of metamodernity is to go beyond the postmodern questioning of language and concepts, beyond the doubts and deep questioning, to see through language or beyond language to the sublime. And that's what he will be offering to us today. Brendan's Sky Meadow Institute describes itself, and I'm going to quote here, an organization devoted to advancing relational, possessive, systems-based thinking about the things that matter most. They expand on this by describing events, research, and online content that brings a complexity lens to issues of meaning and value. The Institute is located in northern Vermont. It's gorgeous. Go to the website and see the pictures. On an organic farm and retreat center where they sponsor educational events, spiritual practices, residential farming opportunities, retreats, research, podcasts, and much more. Brendan's formal education focused on religious studies and art, and he continues robust research as well as writing poetry and farming. I can't wait to ask you offline, Brendan, about your poetry. His broad interests prepare him well to theorize developments in culture and culture after postmodernism. The work he does is made possible by postmodernism, and he seeks to bridge but he is building upon and trying to go deeper, bridging the divide between science and spirituality and developing sustainable systems for life to flourish. His work weaves together paradigms of emergence and complexity. You will not be surprised that Brendan is an avid writer, having produced the 7-volume series Metamodern Spirituality Series. The first book in the series was A Universal Learning Process, the subtitle, The Evolution of Meaning, Book 1, which was based in theories of thermodynamics and information processing. You already get a sense of the broad sweep of his thought. The most recent book is entitled Metamodernism, or The Cultural Logic of Cultural Logics. In all of his work, he attends to evolution, learning, and movement over time. Whether he has his hands in the soil or his nose in a book, Brendan is continually at work on big questions. Brendan was a recent guest on our Conversations in Process podcast, a newly developed or advanced series sponsored by the Center for Process Studies. The podcast link will be put in the chat by Richard Livingston so you can follow up on the full podcast. Let me just say one word about a connection, Brendan, between what you're doing and what Alfred North Whitehead was about. I don't feel like, nor do we in this program feel like we need to make links with Whitehead on everything we do. But there seems to be today quite an important link, and that is that Whitehead was more interested in the novel and the becoming than in static ideas, including his own. And at one point, when he was at Harvard, he participated in a lot of social events, many of them sponsored by himself. And as in these events, they would just have open, free conversation. And he, from time to time, would make comparisons between Walt Whitman and Ralph Waldo Emerson, arguing that Emerson represented the peak of poetic developments, and he was an extraordinary poet. But he himself thought Walt Whitman was a more extraordinary and more important poet because Whitman was willing to experiment and move beyond the forms that had been developing. Emerson representing the height of a form, and Whitman representing the movement toward new forms. And I see your work in metamodernity as doing that. You have recognized, I don't want to oversimplify this, but I'm going to say it in an overly simple way. You've represented, your work represents the recognition of postmodern emergence and refinement. And you're moving beyond in this metamodern movement. And we're so lucky to have you to help us understand and move beyond ourselves. So thank you very much. I will say to the group, we'll come back after Brendan's initial presentation, and we'll have a conversation between him and Jared Morningstar, who is our coordinator of communications in CPS and the Cobb Institute. And he and Brendan are great colleagues that both work on metamodernity. So we're in your hands, Brendan. Thanks.
Wow, thank you. I worry that there's no way I could live up to such an introduction. That was really very generous, and I'm deeply honored to be here. Really deeply honored, to have the opportunity to talk to this community. The work that goes on in this group of folks is very inspiring to me, very directly related to the kinds of work that I'm doing, and I follow a number of folks here very closely and what they're putting out. So there's a lot of synergy, so also hopefully maybe in that very generous introduction, people got a sense of the sorts of things that I'm tracking, but it also might have seemed a little bit maybe overly spread out. So maybe I'll try just for a few minutes to give the gestalt of this, to bring all these things together, because maybe it's not immediately understandable what let's say permaculture and complexity science and evolutionary notions of theology might all have in common. But that really is sort of the nexus point of my work. And so hopefully over the next little bit, it'll become clear all these different really meaningful points of overlap and connection between the stuff that I'm really interested in and the incredible work that's being done in the process field. So yes, I guess probably the best place to start is my role at Sky Meadow. In 2023, just fairly recently, I started Sky Meadow Institute, and we're based up here in Vermont. And our little tagline is, as was said, the attempt to advance complexity-based or systems-based thinking about the things that matter most. And by the things that matter most, we're talking about things that are valuable, things that are meaningful, but also meaning and value themselves. Meaning, how do we get a grip on notions of meaning and value that brings a complexity lens to bear on those topics? So, the more kind of concrete level, things that matter most are very much like, where are we getting our food, and how can we bring a systems lens to that, right? Are we thinking in terms of sort of linear monocropping and sort of agribusiness style, more modernist industrial approaches to food production, or are we thinking of holistic ecologies and the complex systems from which, ecological flourishing and sustainable agricultural practices, where those are situated. So things like food production and governance as well, education, rather than looking at these things in sort of an isolated way or as a particular topic of concern, trying to situate them in social systems, because these are things that matter a great deal. And we see that every day when we turn on the news, how important our institutional frameworks, particularly matters, or institutional frameworks for our political institutions, our governance systems, but our education systems and maintaining an informed electorate, et cetera, how vital those are. So how do we think about those in systemic ways? So these are all things that matter very much, and trying to bring a complexity lens to them is very important. And that's sort of the umbrella category that we're using to look at this. But there's actually kind of a broader category above that, which is not just things that matter, but what does it mean to matter? What does it mean to be of value? And this, I think, is probably the best way into the overall gestalt of the things that I'm trying to do in my work, which is a great way of sort of dovetailing with what was brought up around the meaning crisis. I think is a good way into this topic. The meaning crisis is a term that was popularized by John Vervaeke, who's a university professor at the University of Toronto, neuroscientist and psychologist. And his work is focused a lot around meaning and the shift in sort of meaning-making structures and what meaning means, you could say. And he identified or even diagnosed a phenomenon in our current kind of cultural situation that I think a lot of us have intuited. We've seen kind of the symptoms of, but having a name for it is really important. And he diagnosed this as a meaning crisis, that there's something particularly salient or urgent in our cultural moment right now where there seems to be a breakdown of meaning. People are particularly eager, struggling to orient themselves towards things that they find meaningful, have purpose in life, and can actually identify as being of value. And this seems to be at a sort of collective level, a kind of collective malaise that's really reached into all levels of the system that we are a part of and having rather pathological effects. And so this kind of increasingly pervasive kind of nihilistic undercurrent to our culture at the moment is something that we should all be particularly concerned with, both at the individual level, because people are suffering. There's a mental health crisis. We have diseases of despair and addiction, that sort of a thing, depression, in a kind of record numbers. Work by folks like Jonathan Haidt, who are tracking particularly the younger generation, Gen Z and kind of lower, are really identifying that and linking it to our technological situation and providing some really important and scary statistics around these sorts of things. But it's sort of cross demographic. I mean, we see this kind of pervasively. And so the question there is like, what's going on there? What level of analysis could we use to be able to get a little bit into that and actually be able to kind of get our hands around it and tackle that, because it's such a crucial, important concerns. And again, as I was saying, not just at the individual level of people suffering, but collectively, systemically, if we live in a society where people are profoundly confused about meaning, purpose, and value, and there seems to be an increasing number of folks for whom these are themselves kind of meaningless categories, there's all number of kind of social pathologies then that are going to kind of creep in and infest our kind of social fabric. And arguably, we're seeing that all over the place, and we're seeing many instances of various kinds of institutional decay, and sort of a certain kind of breakdown between public sense making and meaning making. So there's a certain kind of urgency around this question of meaning, which is inherently bound up with issues of value as well. Meaning, value, purpose, all of that. And for me, as I'll get into in a minute, this is all deeply all connected as well to the sacred issues of God, theology, purpose at that kind of ultimate level of concern. So this is sort of the sphere of questioning that I'm suggesting requires itself a kind of complexity lens that we need to bring to bear on these issues, a requisite level of nuance and sophistication and depth and systems thinking ultimately to these questions, as I think really helpful responses to this situation and ways to ameliorate this kind of profound collective meaning crisis by trying to offer, I think, a very compelling framework for reconceptualizing what these things are. What is meaning? What is value? And what is the sacred? And I think hopefully I've kind of set up what the sense of urgency is around doing that from kind of a cultural level. If we wanted to dig into that more, though, it does relate to these broader issues that was brought up a minute ago around the kind of movement from postmodern thought into metamodern thought. So I'll touch on that briefly to kind of plug that line in here, because it is really important. So arguably, a lot of these ideas around meaning and value saw kind of their own kind of systemic deconstruction under the kind of postmodern paradigm that has been very dominant in academia. And this has kind of been well, it's been, yeah, in a kind of Kuhnian sense, the dominant paradigm, particularly in institutions of learning, and increasingly in other sectors of society. And it has attached to it a particular kind of research program, as paradigms do, and certain kinds of strategies that are explored to achieve certain ends and generate certain kinds of knowledge, you could say. But in this case, the knowledge that's being generated is sort of deconstructive knowledge. And what I mean by that is postmodern thought has focused primarily on taking up these sort of broad categories and applying some really incisive philosophical critique to them in such a way to bring to the fore certain contradictions, certain kind of ways in which our assumptions are revealed to be deeply problematic. In fact, you could even say that postmodernism itself is kind of just like problematization is sort of at the essence of the kind of postmodern move. And if you go to even an art gallery and you look at postmodern art, that's always what you'll find in the little artist statement. This piece seeks to problematize X, Y, and Z. Now, what's important about this, though, is that this is really necessary because we want to be doing good philosophy and we want to be thinking critically. And that, since Plato, if not before, has required taking a deep critical look at our cultural, social, personal set of assumptions and subjecting them to really intense scrutiny. And I mean, even going back again to Plato and Socrates, it was found that when you take a concept like justice or, truth or beauty, and you subject it to that kind of analysis, you find a lot of contradictions, and you find that what people maybe thought was the case actually falls apart under deep analysis. And so, in a sense, the postmodern paradigm really perfected this, or at least really emphasized this approach to approaching categories of knowledge and taking ideas that were formerly our sort of concepts or frameworks for knowledge and deconstructing them. So if you go to an anthropology department, you'd think that you'd be learning about human culture, but actually most anthropology classes will spend a great deal of time telling you why culture is an inherently problematic concept. For me, in my undergrad, I studied religious studies. And we spent a lot of time in every class and even a whole seminar on the topic of what is religion, and basically proceeding to kind of deconstruct that category and to problematize it. And so across kind of the humanities in particular, this has been the approach, is to deconstruct these grand categories and to show them to be problematic in nature. And the problem with this is just that once you do that work, there's sort of the then what, right? And I've had great conversations with folks in the process field. I was talking to Jay McDaniel, and we were talking about reconstructive postmodernism, because these ideas have been around for a while. People have recognized that there's a certain kind of limit that gets reached, that, okay, you can deconstruct things, but where's the reconstructive approach to this? And this is really where this metamodern approach is coming in. Work like by the likes of people like Jason Ananda, Josephson Storm, particularly has done great work to kind of offer a systematic metamodern philosophy, but other works and other research into a kind of growing sensibility in culture more broadly around this sort of metamodern turn is a lot of where my work is oriented to. And so to connect these things kind of up together with each other, there is a sense in which meaning and value, you could say, have been deconstructed in a kind of postmodern context. If you ask your kind of proverbial man on the street these days, what is meaning? Almost, you could be a Socratic gadfly, go downtown and ask people, what is meaning? And they would say, well, meaning, that's subjective. It's just whatever people think is meaningful is meaningful, right? Okay, so then why do you have your meanings, and what are they based on, these sorts of things? All that, then once you kind of just scratch the surface of that way of thinking, starts to produce some really profound destabilizations of all the sorts of things that might kind of orient people in their lives. And if you say, well, yeah, I guess then that means that my whole sense of meaning is just a social construction, right? And that ... Similarly with value, right? Like, what is value? Well, value, that's, different people value different things. It's all in the eye of the beholder, that sort of thing. nothing's really inherently valuable. That would be problematic and all these things. And so unfortunately, the consequence of this, which is actually initially a really an important move because we need to do this kind of critical analysis, but the consequence is that people kind of get lost in the product. And when I say that it's an important move, I should also contrast this with what could have been provided as answers. If you go back, in time, pre the dominance of sort of postmodern thought, where much more traditional ways of thinking, predominated, you would have found ready answers of, oh, well, meaning, well, that's just inherent to reality, whether people would have used that language or not, or that's given by God, and so you can't question meaning or value. Well, of course, if God created the world, then He wanted that. It's based in God's will, let's say, and there's an intentionality to the cosmos. The whole kind of framework for thinking about meaning and purpose and value was very much situated in a kind of traditional cosmic view. That was deeply entwined with religious thought and notions of basically a kind of cosmic intentionality that was a sort of background context that that while really deeply meaningful and salient for people and a great sense of orientation, was susceptible to deconstruction when considered in that kind of hyper, critical way. And so that's essentially what happened, is that traditional notions of meaning and value moving from the traditional kind of sphere of thought into the modern mode when scientific study and mechanistic thought became much more predominant, started to question inherited notions of meaning and value and their sort of inherency in existence. And looked for, where is meaning, where is value, right? I can look in a microscope and I don't see meaning and value. I can't measure it, right? And this move into a much more kind of mechanistic and materialistic mode with modern thought really called into question some of the assumptions of pre-modern thought, and necessarily had to sort of relegate whatever we meant by meaning and value to our subjective sphere. Because if I don't see it out in the objective world, then I guess it has to be subjective. And this is a kind of line of thought that gets picked up by later postmodernists, who even kind of further radicalize it and say, not only is it kind of just in your head, what's in your head is a sort of co-created social invention that you've gotten by means of your collective society. And so you get a kind of further radicalization of kind of just how non-essentially real, quote unquote, meaning and value are. And so that's kind of the climate that we live in now around these topics, which is these ideas have permeated very much into popular culture and spread very widely, but only to the point where people have a sense of what those deconstructive moves are, but not what kind of can come after that. I think people have sensed now, and certainly there's a kind of social pressure to adopt the perspective that everything is relative, everything is, certainly around meaning and value, very subjective. And a lot of this also has a lot of political implications for how we get on well in a kind of pluralistic society. Because if your meaning is your meaning and my meaning is my meaning, well, we don't have to, come to blows over anything, because we can just accept a kind of, kind of relativism that'll keep everyone happy. And so there's all sorts of kind of pragmatic and sort of social justificatory reasons why this also has become kind of a stalemate and an impasse in thought. And I guess what I would say then is that this is an incomplete movement. This is an unsatisfactory conclusion, as evidenced by the meaning crisis, which increasingly people are identifying and is increasingly, well, actually measurable if you look at the metrics around the psychometrics around like well-being and these again diseases of despair and whatnot. It turns out that this is not a very helpful conclusion to the question of meaning and value. And so in recent times, I think there's been a kind of strong movement to try to get beyond that and to try to articulate a sense of what this could mean that is not kind of naively traditionalist in nature, nor is it just kind of crudely mechanistic in nature, like the modern perspective was, nor is it just sort of radically socially constructivist and relativistic like the postmodern view. If we could find some other way of approaching this, then people might have a sense of being able to justify the sense that there is meaning to life, that there is value in existence, and maybe even things like sacredness. And so that seems to be the moment that we're particularly at in a kind of crisis point. And that, I think, is kind of what allows us to set the stage for this notion of metamodernism or metamodernity. As people are recognizing this, trying to respond to it, there seems to be the recognition that these earlier ways of conceptualizing it were insufficient. And if that's the case, then we need to we can't, let's say, construct notions of meaning and value that are as simplistic as that. We must be able to integrate what was rightly critiqued about why those notions failed from a sufficiently complex orientation that can recontextualize and allow us to reconceive what we mean by meaning and value from a much more complex vantage. So we need to do justice to the critiques that have been done, but we also would like to move beyond that impasse. And that, I think, in a nutshell, is kind of what this metamodern thing is gesturing towards, is moving beyond postmodernism, but by means of postmodernism. And I think this is also particularly urgent because, as we're seeing all around today, there's a lot of sort of broadly regressive moves in the air in being confronted with this kind of crisis that we're facing collectively and individually around these topics. There's a certain attraction to want to just sort of run away from the issue and try to pick up a more kind of immediately comfortable and reassuring sense of meaning and value that might be rooted in older notions that we all know have come to be critiqued for good reason, in large part, and so don't really kind of bear out. And yet there's certainly much more satisfying explanations to reality than a sense of, oh, well, life is all meaningless and you're just a meat suit hurling on a rock through space, etc. And so this is a very urgent kind of political thing as well, sociological issue as well. We would do very well collectively to situate ourselves to these topics in a way that has sufficient nuance and complexity to match the complexity of our present moment, but also in a way that can give us a justification for properly orienting ourselves towards meaning and value, without which, of course, things fall apart. So that's a great segue then to talk about what I'm trying to articulate around this topic, having set the stage a little bit for it, because that last notion there, I think, allows us a way in to be able to think about these concepts from a new vantage, which is to say, without meaning and value, things fall apart. We're witnessing that all around us. And again, we can see that individually as well, that there seems to be this profoundly existential, in all senses of the term, significance to this notion of meaning and value, without which things break down, they dissolve, they do not continue to cohere. And so in a nutshell, what my work is largely trying to do is bring a complexity lens to questions of meaning and value, by specifically drawing on the frameworks of complexity science, which include things like far from equilibrium thermodynamics, which include things like kind of notions of cosmic complexification narratives and big history narratives based on those. And when you do that, and I guess it goes without saying, I think that this is a promising and approach. I think that we wind up being able to resolve a lot of issues this way, because when you do that, you can reconsider what these topics mean in a way that can be very satisfactorily grounded in some kind of first principles physics ideas, which for me relies heavily on notions of thermodynamics and the second law of thermodynamics around entropy. I won't get into all the details, so we can maybe, when Jared and I talk in just a second, we can unpack this a little bit. But in short, the basic notion would be, if we can recognize that meaning is actually a form of, well, you could say it like this: meaning is a kind of information. And I also failed to mention complexity science deals a lot with information theory as well. So the kind of nexus between thermodynamics, information theory, and that sort of thing. If you look at meaning as a kind of information that links entities to their environments in such a way that bears on their increased viability and flourishing, then you can begin to cognize how meaning is, one, actually a very real thing and not just something that we make up in our heads, but two, how it might undergo itself a processual growth and change and a development and a complexification over time. And real briefly, what I mean by that is if these principles go all the way down into certain kind of thermodynamic necessity, such that you could do this kind of analysis for a rock or a table, or even just the most simplest kind of molecule, right? That there's a particular organizational configuration, which is a kind of informational entity, and that entity exists in a context, so it's a relational entity in a context, and that there's information, correlated between that entity and its context, that actually a subset of that correlated information is information specifically that bears on its continued viability, then there is a kind of evolutionary need or requirement for that thing in context to learn, you could say, in a loose, maybe semantic way, but actually increasingly more literal, learn that information about itself and its environment for evolutionarily adaptive purposes, or at least, let's say, to not fall apart, to not succumb to the second law of thermodynamics. So a very crude and maybe kind of banal and seemingly, I don't know, generic and gray sounding way of framing it, but incredibly promising, because once we're able to situate meaning within a thermodynamic and an informational kind of processing kind of framework, then we're actually able to see how, in moving through cosmic complexification from material entities to biological entities to sort of neuronally constituted complex animals to human beings, we see a complexification of information processing systems that are able to essentially learn meaning better and better over evolution. And this, to me, presents us with a very profound idea of thinking about ourselves and what role we play in the world, what we are, why we're here, that sort of a thing. Because we're able then to situate the kind of meaning that we experience as people and the sorts of values that we have as people within a broader framework that actually is not some pure, radically socially constructed fantasy that we're just projecting onto reality, but is actually a real relationship between ourselves and the world that we're a part of, that we're navigating as kind of the spear point of an evolutionary process that goes back billions of years. And that over this process, you could say the universe itself has kind of made progressive evolutionary leaps in terms of being able to better process information about these transjective relationships in such a way that meaning and value themselves evolve because they become more complex, more informationally rich, and more sophisticated over time. And so, one, I think that this is a profound opportunity for people to reconceive what they mean by meaning. Two, it's a sufficiently complex notion in a way that allows us to account for the different ways that historically people have made sense of the idea of meaning and value, but owns those critiques for being incomplete explanations of these phenomena, and better situates them within a more kind of integrative and explanatory framework. Three, again, to emphasize, allows people to realize that there is a reality to meaning. There's a reality to value, and it's neither things that are totally radically subjective, but neither is it objective in the world. You can't go out and find value. You have to navigate value transjectively in a relationship between yourself and the world, and that is a real relationship, because if you are misoriented towards meaning and value, you'll fall apart. And so there are real consequences to breakdowns of correct meaning making. And of course, then all of this allows us to better understand the situation that we're in collectively and individually as people are facing entropic internal breakdown, you could say, but also collectively sort of political breakdowns and institutional breakdowns. It frames a way forward in terms of the paths that need to be taken. It orients us to solutions, right? If we can sense that this is a deep cause, perhaps the deep cause of these instabilities and destructuralizations that are occurring in society right now, then properly orienting ourselves to meaning and value will be at the crux of entering a flourishing form of society that's actually sustainable. And finally, there's a lot more I could say about this, but I think it radically reorients us to understand what the sacred is, by appreciating that the sacred in many ways represents the enshrinement of successful meaning making that has occurred in the past, while also serving as sort of the template or what in sort of Bayesian updating terms would be called the priors for predicting reality as well. So you're able to use your sense of what has worked in the past to generate novel solutions to new problems. And if you conceive of the sacred working in that sense, there's a profound way in which the sacred is that thing that shores things up. It's the kind of due reverence paid to that which has allowed an entity to flourish historically and gives a good sense of what will continue to allow that entity to flourish, but also becomes the basis upon which further changes and developments and differentiations can occur, which is how learning is always unfolding. Meaning that the sacred as it has been is not necessarily the sacred as it will be, but it is the basis upon which the sacred can change and evolve in response to increased learning, increased learning through learning processes at both the individual and collective level. And so this whole framework gives us a way of thinking about the evolution of religion, the evolution of the sacred, and the evolution of God, which is ultimately what got me into studying all this stuff as my particular project of interest. So that's a rough introduction to me. I went a little bit longer than I wanted to, but I just wanted to give people a sense of how all these things kind of cohere in a sort of gestalt in my mind, and the promise that I think that they offer, and to appreciate that, yeah, this is the sort of work that I think is being done that can be meaningfully done at the cutting edge of sort of our cultural discourse, moving beyond postmodern deconstruction into reconstructive modes that can more complexly allow us to consider and understand what meaning and value are, ultimately for the sake of saving our crumbling or at least suffering civilization, and trying to be effective contributions to a broader cultural civilizational project that seems to be sorely needed at the moment. Because if we don't break through to more complex notions of meaning and value, then we're going to break down and we're going to regress. And we're seeing many signs of that around us. So I'm very excited by what these things can afford us. I'm really excited by being able to participate in these and participate with people like Jared and other folks in the metamodern conversation, to see the work that's happening among processual thinkers, and the people who are talking about the evolution of the sacred. And of course, then, the invitation that poses to bring in Whiteheadian notions of primordial inconsequent God and things of that nature. There's a rich framework here that I feel like is before us. And I think increasingly people are waking up to the need for that framework and also the kind of genuine insights that it offers. And so that is kind of what my work is all about. So I'll stop there and we can start moving into some more dialogue, and then I'd love to hear some questions from other folks. But yeah, thanks.
So thank you so much, Brendan. This was super clear and on a very complex topic. And thank you very much for the work you're doing and your presentation. We're moving now into a conversation between you and Jared. So take it away.
Thanks, Mary Elizabeth. And thanks, Brendan. That was, definitely an excellent overview of all these intersecting topics here for folks. One thing I think could be helpful for our audience here today is to talk a little bit more about what complexity means and what this whole kind of lineage of systems thinking is. Certainly something that's very resonant with our process community here, but a discourse I haven't seen intersecting so much. So perhaps this can be a seed for that.
Yeah, good and important question. I mean, there's a lot of ways you could unpack that. I would say there's a couple of strands here I would want to at least just mention, because it's a whole field, right? And so I don't want to just kind of unpack, even if I could, kind of the origins of where a whole kind of discipline came from. But out of the gate, I can say when we refer to complexity science, we're referring to a sort of nexus of fields and methodologies that relate to things like far from equilibrium thermodynamics. And what I mean by that is kind of classic thermodynamics looks at, I have a gas in a container and what happens when it'll reach equilibrium, over time, right? But what's interesting is that if you have an open system and energy flows into a system, you can actually get the generation of order and complex phenomena. So more structured entities can actually emerge through entirely spontaneous thermodynamic principles, which opens up a whole exciting set of possibilities for trying to understand, where does order and complexity in nature come from, and where does life come from, et cetera. And I should maybe step back to address the first question, which is like, what is complexity? And there are many ways you can define it, but one way would be complexity is the coming together of parts to form novel wholes. And usually those wholes are complex to the degree that they have what are called emergent properties. So there's some sense in which the sum is greater, or the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. That there's a kind of a level of causal influence in the world that is emergent upon, but based upon earlier parts coming together to form new structural configurations that have new properties. So it's emergent from and irreducible to, but it is based on lower level phenomena, but they get linked up and connected in such a way that you get more complex phenomena with new kinds of capacities. So that's kind of what one notion of complexity would be, is getting more structural parts coming together and having more of that process unfold. And then you can talk about that in informational terms, right? That like you can imagine how simplistically put, right, like the complexity, if we were to kind of somehow translate the complexity of Jared Morningstar into Shannon information theory, right, which is like bits, that kind of language, there's going to be more of that to describe you in all the complexity of how you behave than, say, a dung beetle. And the dung beetle will require greater levels of informational richness to explain than, say, a single subatomic particle or something, right? So there's a kind of spectrum of complexity, and that spectrum has built up over evolutionary history, such that when you go back to the Big Bang, you're looking at basically radiation in a very kind of homogeneous, near equilibrium kind of state that successively unfolds into increasing epochs of increasingly complex phenomena. And so you can begin to chart this using the language of information theory. You can look at it in terms of energy, when again, getting back to the thermodynamics bit, because everything that is a complex entity is a differentiation. And in a universe governed by the second law of thermodynamics, which pushes everything towards homogeneity and random equilibrium, then you need energy to fight back against entropy and have complexity. So there's a whole set of really fascinating principles, relationships that this way of thinking affords us, that when we apply them to various domains in nature, are very revealing. And it's an inherently transdisciplinary conversation then, because you can apply this way of looking to, like a thermos and its equal thermodynamic properties. You can apply it to a human being. You can apply it to a social organism. And so that's kind of the stuff that my work a little bit is exploring. So the last thing I guess I'll say about that is, this is a field that really comes into its own in the late 20th century. It has some deep roots earlier than that. You look at people, the British emergentists, as they were called back in the late 19th century and early 20th century, who rightly were recognizing that kind of crude, mechanistic, reductionistic approaches to things like mind don't really work very well. And so we need better accounts for that. And we're positing notions of emergence. And that gets picked up in a real way in the latter 20th century, once you get really advanced computer modeling and just the invention of computers and the ability to do these iterative processing calculations that was never possible before. And you get the invention or the discovery of things like attractors and things like that. Maybe just the simplest way of getting it is, if anyone's ever seen the movie Jurassic Park, Jeff Goldblum's character, I forget when that movie came out. I think it was like 92 or something, but he's a chaos theorist. And that chaos theory winds up becoming what we would today call systems theory or complex system science. And so it plays a lot with that stuff. More to say about that, obviously, but hopefully that's kind of a rough orientation to what this all is.
Yeah, definitely very helpful. So you gave a wonderful kind of intellectual tour here of so many topics, and it's very rich. But I would be remiss to not invite you to say a bit more about what goes on at Sky Meadow, and how you've been building community and co-creating practices, ritual, metamodern spirituality in ways beyond just kind of the intellectual mode. So Yeah, what's going on at this place up in Vermont there?
Yeah, a lot of things. And that's really ultimately, where the rubber meets the road and why this stuff is ultimately important. The purpose is not just to have fun with theory. It's very much about it's about reconceiving and reframing reality and our relationship to it in ways that generate flourishing. And a simple word that captures all that is wisdom. That's really what wisdom is about. I mentioned John Vervaeke earlier, but he does a lot of work in the wisdom space for that reason, because if you're misoriented to meaning and value, then another term for that might be there's a form of foolishness, certainly, or we could even just say ignorance. These things are deeply related. If we better understood how things work, then maybe we can be better oriented to reality and to our own and others flourishing in reality. So there's a sense in which all this ultimately is itself meaningful if it has a real life implication, if it actually matters to us. And so a big component of this is generating or creating the space for community to be generated and for people to come together who are exploring these topics in these ways, and find people to converse with, find people to engage in shared spiritual practice with. And so we do a number of things. There's kind of a set of programming aspects to Sky Meadow Institute. The biggest for me are the Metamodern Spirituality Labs. And of course, you've been to a number of those yourself, and are really important figure in that scene, I would say, where basically around 20 folks come out here to Sky Meadow, and we spend a chunk of time working the land. We spend a chunk of time emergently co-creating a ritual, opening ritual ceremony. And we have a lot of time spent over the weekend for conversation and for just connecting. And so it's a place to come together for folks that resonate with these kinds of approaches to these important issues and are also curious about them and want to learn more and live more into them. We have a space for, just providing an opportunity for people to do that. Those are headed by Layman Pascal. He's the one who leads the conversations. Brilliant human being, wonderful human being. And we've done, I want to say 5 of them now. They happen, spring, fall. So that's one big way. There are other things that we do. There's a press through Sky Meadow Institute. So one of the whole visions of the place is, we're trying to advance or promote these ideas in this way of seeing and being. And so I've been kind of reaching out and finding folks who are sort of who I can really consider kind of leading thinkers in this field, and basically asking if they'd be willing to publish a book through Sky Meadow Press. And we've got a number of those out now. So Layman Pascal published his book on Gurdjieff. I published mine on the Universal Learning Process book that was mentioned. Greg Enriquez published his book on UTalk, the Unified Theory of Knowledge, which is a big history complexification framework. And we've got about 3 other books already in the pipeline for, if not the end of this year, then going into next year. So trying to put things out into the world and kind of foreground authors is a big thing. We'll be doing some online events next year, as well as some virtual events with people like Tim Freak, who's really been talking a lot about emergent spirituality. And I'm excited to work with him. So it's a number of things, working with different people in the field, publishing their works, getting together with community, and trying to turn this into a more also kind of lived experience. In December right now, we have planned I'm calling it the Chapel of Awe. It's a temporary monastic container where for a week, people can come and we'll stay in the barn and we'll meditate and we'll kind of live a kind of simple monastic life, and we'll read complexity books, and we'll engage in the kind of symbolic rendering of different sort of alchemical imaginal reflections of the sacred in these terms. So that just gives you a taste of the sorts of things that we're cultivating, curating here. Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about some of these rituals that have been co-created to feel out what a metamodern approach to spirituality, the sacred, these kind of classic major themes in religion and spirituality. What are these rituals consist of?
Yeah, well, the wonderful thing about the rituals has been a number of things. One, the vibe, the sensibility that we come to in engaging it. There's many different ways of doing ritual, and they serve different purposes. And sometimes it's perfect to just have the most kind of sense of, this is the ritual. It's always been done this way, and I'm going to do it correctly, and that's kind of what it is. But there are other ways of doing ritual, which are getting a bunch of people together, and maybe you don't even know what is going to unfold, but you are going to collectively plan something that will be a ritual for a container that people are going to enter into. And that's a different approach to it, but it's a very special one for me because as it was mentioned, I studied religion and the arts, and I'm really interested in the creative, as also, many processual thinkers are, and Whiteheadians too. So where is that sweet spot between kind of an apprehension of the transcendent and an expression of creativity? And for me, a great metaphor, maybe more than metaphor, is emergence, right? That there's something that comes out of when you get a bunch of parts together, they assemble, and something unpredictable happens that's very powerful, and more powerful than anything that the individual parts could have done on their own. So that's kind of the context for this ritual construction that we do. People come together, we walk the land, we kind of start thinking, brainstorming. There's a theme for the various metamodern labs that we do. And so we kind of use that to orient ourselves to whatever this kind of ritual will be. We'll go through the property, and we'll just kind of brainstorm together. We'll collectively think together, and we'll think about what would be meaningful to create. And so just to give an example of this sort of thing, we did a lab where the theme was God, or maybe God question mark. It was sort of a metamodern exploration of, what is this term? How do we mean it? What does a particularly sort of metamodern perspective on God look like? And so the opening ritual that we constructed was unsurprisingly about that. It was about God, and specifically the evolution of God, and the specific kind of moments in the complexification, you could say, or the development of particular God concepts through time. And so I thought it was a very meaningful and just cool and exciting participatory way to relate to that, right? And beginning and sort of kind of more ancient Neolithic animistic notions of the divine, moving into notions of polytheistic representations of the divine, moving into monotheistic, and then modern notions where these ideas become kind of broken down, and into postmodern and so on. And what was fun was that it wasn't just, it was informed by theory, certainly, but it was a chance to embody it as well, of actually coming up to these different stations and engaging with a different kind of conceptualization of the divine, and literally moving through the evolution of God, you could say, at least as, kind of ritually represented. Yeah, that's kind of, we do that, and I'm always amazed at kind of how things cohere, and the kind of things that get produced in that space, because it really is something just truly emergent, special. And you never really know until you do it, and when you do it, you think that was amazing. So it's a mixture, yeah, of that kind of like creative, artistic expression with a very earnest engagement with the transcendent, in an effort also to experiment, hence why we call them labs, with novel forms of religious, action, with religious praxis, right? If we're moving out of postmodernism and into metamodern, let's say, and we're moving into different and more, let's just say, different notions of the divine, what are the ways that these need to be embodied and instantiated and lived out, when you don't have a clear, sort of given text or psalter or, liturgical set of expectations that have already been created. So we're kind of living that creation, and we're doing it together, which feels really cool.
The way I've described the Metamodern labs to folks is some kind of mix between philosophy conference, meditation retreat, summer camp, and some kind of Dionysian romp. And I think that captures it pretty well.
Yeah.
So I know we want to turn to the conversation with the broader group soon, but just as kind of one final question here, say a little bit about kind of the ecological connection as well. I know certainly you're producing food on a farm at this location, and that also is part of the activity of various groups that you have coming around, and it's certainly not incidental to some of the theory and other practices here as well. So yeah, could you
Yeah.
expand on that connection a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, it's Sky Meadow is a 115 acre working farm and homestead. Our it used to be an old dairy barn, which it was renovated and converted into the main retreat lodging space. And we've got, yeah, basically a big garden here. And we engage in organic gardening and try to live into sort of permacultural practices where we're trying to integrate our systems as much as possible. I was really inspired by folks. Actually, well, there's a funny story. I I went and did my master's at Yale Divinity School because I still had this thought of maybe I'll go into academia. And then I thought, no, that's not the right direction for me. And I wound up coming out of there and instead going to work at a nursery, like a plant nursery, because during that period, I was feeling increasingly that like ecological sustainability and let's just say, yeah, environmental catastrophe are very urgent and potent topics, and that they required a lot of attention, and I wanted to learn about that. I wanted to deepen into that because I felt like it was very, very important. And so that was part of the way that I originally found Sky Meadow, because I was looking to gain some skills in that. But that is very much kind of the background set of kind of the vision for this place, or at least informs the vision of what we're doing here, because we're trying to also model, in a sense, more sustainable, more holistic style practices of food production and consumption and energy use and consumption, those sorts of things. One has ideals and all that, and so we try our best with what we've got. But that's certainly, it's important at kind of a conceptual visionary level that's a deeply interwoven aspect of what we do here. But it's also, for me, it's a very profoundly spiritual thing as well. Mary Elizabeth was saying, I either have my nose in a book or my hands in the soil, and that's basically right. Like that's how I would aspire to be as a person. Sometimes I have my nose in the books too much, and then I'm like, oh, I gotta get out. But I think that that's really important, and having the incredible privilege of stewarding this incredible land is amazing. And so I'm trying to live up to that incredible opportunity as well. And for me, I feel greatly fortunate to be able to have the opportunity to do that, to be able to go outside and grow garlic and onions and cabbage and potatoes and all these other things. It's very grounding for me, and it's also very important, I think, that again, we have those kind of grounding frameworks, because it's very easy for meta theorists and complexity theorists to kind of go off in the clouds and these sorts of things and be talking about very heady, abstract, conceptual topics. But again, none of that really, I don't want to say it doesn't mean anything, but I think you know what I mean. It doesn't mean anything in the sense that if you're not grounding that and it's not actually speaking to reality and flourishing and wisdom, then what good is it, in a sense, right? And so for me, engaging with the land and the soil and trying to integrate, our sheep and our chickens with, the whole system of everything here in this kind of cyclical, natural way is part of that. So, and having the occasion for these events that we host too, for people to engage in that, I hope is very helpful and meaningful for people who are coming from places, where this is more novel, and can hopefully learn some skills and appreciation for that.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for the presentation. Always a joy to be in conversation with you. And yeah, very much looking forward to you getting to know some of the folks in the community here and continuing the dialogue. So thank you.
Well, real quick, I also just want to say, and a special thanks to you, Jared, for really being key to, bridging these communities, bringing to my attention so much of the awesome work that's happening, the work that you do, promotion wise, marketing wise, all the stuff that you're engaged in is really awesome. And I hear from various people too. Like I was talking to Jason Storm, and you came up because it's just you're really a wonderful interweaver of communities and ideas here in a really invaluable way. And so I've appreciated that. I've appreciated your interpersonal contribution and your intellectual contribution. So I just wanted to give a big shout out to you, and yeah, much appreciated.
The feeling is absolutely, completely mutual. So
Thank you for those words, Brendan, to Jared. We think he's a superstar in all the ways that you've just named. Thanks a lot. And this dialogue between the two of you has been incredibly rich. We thank you both.